Graphical editing can be a difficult process and involve many repetitive tasks. To remove some of the tedium and make the job easier, we have developed a number of example-based techniques. These techniques, which I will demonstrate in this videotape, have all been incorporated into the graphics and interface editing modes of Chimera, an editor that we have built to serve as a testbed for research in demonstrational interfaces. At the right of the screen is a Chimera graphical editor window. This window contains a gray equilateral triangle. To the upper left is the Match Tool window. Match Tool is a utility for graphical search and replace. Graphical search and replace is useful for making repetitive changes to graphical properties or object shape. In the upper left-hand corner of the Match Tool is the Search pane, a fully editable graphical canvas in which objects can be drawn or copied. This pane contains the search pattern. Similarly, in the upper right-hand portion of the Match Tool window is the Replacement pane, which contains the replacement pattern. Below these windows are rows of graphical attributes, followed by two columns of checkboxes. The first column of checkboxes specifies which attributes of the object in the Search pane will be used for the search. The second column indicates which properties of the objects in a replacement pane will be applied to the match. Here we have specified a pattern to find equilateral triangles of any scale and replace them with three smaller triangles while keeping the match's original graphical properties, such as color. We now look at the graphical editor scene again. When I press the Change All button in the Match Tool, the gray triangle is subdivided into three smaller gray triangles. If I now select Fill Color in the Replacement column, when a replacement is performed, the new triangles will get their colors from the triangles in the replacement pane. Once more, I press the Change All button in the Match Tool, and the equilateral triangles are subdivided again, but this time they receive their colors from the replacement pattern. Now I'm going to select Fill Color from the Search column and deselect it from the Replacement column. Since the Search pane contains a yellow triangle, the Match Tool will search only for yellow triangles, and the replacements will be yellow. I press Change All, and the yellow triangles subdivide. I press Change All once again, and the smaller yellow triangles are subdivided. I press Change All a final time, and get even smaller triangles. Graphical search and replace can be used to create shapes such as these, formed by graphical grammars, but it's also useful for more mundane editing tasks. Graphical search and replace can be used to search for exact shapes in a scene, but it cannot be used to search for particular geometric relationships. We have developed another technique called Constraint-Based search and replace that performs such tasks. Below the Match Tool window is the Rule Tool. The Rule Tool is a facility that allows users to archive collections of graphically defined search and replace rules. I select a rule that I had defined earlier, called Make Line Tangent to Circle, and press the Put button to copy this rule into the Match Tool window above. This rule finds lines that have endpoints nearly tangent to circles and makes them precisely tangent. To the right of the Match Tool is the Constraint Tool, a utility for viewing and editing constraints. Constraint-based search and replace rules can contain constraints in both their search and replacement patterns. We are now using the Constraint Tool to view the constraints in the Search pane of the Match Tool. The search pattern contains two constraints. As I select a constraint in the Constraint Tool, a graphical representation of that constraint is drawn in the editor scene. Here is a distance constraint that specifies that the top vertex of the line must lie on the circle. The scene also contains an angle constraint that the angle between the center of the circle, the top vertex of the line, and the bottom vertex must be 90 degrees. Together, these constraints specify that the line must be tangent to the circle at an endpoint. The illustration in the Search pane does not satisfy these constraints exactly. It provides the tolerance of the search by example. Objects in the scene that fulfill these constraints, at least as well as the search pattern, are considered valid matches. The replacement pattern also contains constraints. It contains both constraints of the search pattern, the constraint that one endpoint lie on the circle, and also the 90-degree angle constraint. When a replacement is made, these constraints are applied to the matched objects. However, there are several additional constraints in the replacement pane. There are a number of ways to make a line and circle tangent. We can move and grow the circle. We can translate the entire line. Here we show additional constraints that specify that for our solution, we want only the vertex near the circle to move. We have loaded into the Chimera editor a scene containing lines and circles. The replacement pattern will take lines nearly tangent to circles and make them tangent. I press the Change All button in the Match Tool, and the scene is promptly transformed according to the user-defined replacement rule. Constraint-based search and replace is a mechanism for inferring constraints from a static scene according to user-defined graphical rules. Sometimes it's difficult to infer constraints from a static scene, but using another technique, constraints from multiple snapshots, Chimera can infer intended constraints from several configurations of an illustration. In the Chimera editor scene on the right, we have a horizontal line and a quadrilateral. We want the editor to generate constraints such that the two middle vertices of the quadrilateral will remain fixed in space, and we want the quadrilateral to remain a rhombus. We also want the horizontal line to remain to the right of the bottom vertex of the rhombus at the same height and x offset. Initially, we take a snapshot of the scene by pressing the snapshot button in the constraint tool. Next, we edit the scene into another valid configuration. We make the rhombus taller by dragging the bottom vertex and the top vertex, and we move the horizontal line to be level with the bottom vertex. Next, we take another snapshot of the scene. Now let's view the constraints that the editor found. These are listed in the constraint tool. The first constraint is that the left angle must be equal to the right angle. The second constraint is that the top angle must be the same as the bottom. There are other constraints as well. Now let's turn constraints on. I'll select the horizontal line and move it. I'll move it upwards. The rhombus resizes accordingly. I can also select the bottom vertex of the rhombus and move it down. The top vertex and the horizontal line move accordingly. The constraints in our system are multi-directional. I can select the top vertex and drag it, and all of the other objects reconfigure correctly. We have also developed a new visual representation for commands in a graphical user interface. This representation is called Editable Graphical Histories. At the top right of the screen is a Chimera editor window. To its left is a control panel, and below is a graphical history window. As I draw in the editor window, panels appear in the history window below. The history follows a comic strip metaphor, where important events are distributed over a sequence of panels. We follow several strategies to make the histories more manageable and more readily understood. Sequences of related operations are coalesced into individual panels. For example, the 5 add-line operations that I executed to draw the polyline are coalesced into a single panel. I can use an interactive elaboration mechanism to expand this panel into lower-level panels, or to coalesce them again. If we were to represent the entire screen in each panel, it would be difficult to see the panel's action. Instead, we zoom in on the region of the scene where the change was made. We also include a little bit of scene context to show where the operation was performed. We render the panel objects in a graphical style according to their role in the explanation. Contextual objects are subdued by lightening their colors. I'm now going to create a circle in the editor scene. Next, I select and copy the circle a number of times. All copies are coalesced into a single panel. Histories can be used to review operations that have been performed during a session with an application. They can also be used for undo and redo. I can make the panels editable by selecting a checkbox at the bottom of the history window. Now all panels become fully editable graphical canvases. I am now going to select the circle in the history panel right before the copy operations. I'm going to change its color. I'll type a shade of yellow into the text input widget and execute the change color operation. The circle in the panel has become yellow. Now I can select the panel and ask that its changes be propagated into the history. The graphical editor scene updates itself. The original circle and all of its copies are now yellow. The history window is also updated. The command that I executed in the panel is now inserted into the history, and the color of the circle copies in the history are also updated. I can also delete operations from any point in the history. Here I select the panel containing the 5 add-line operations, and then execute the delete selected panels operation from the history menu. The editor scene now appears as though these operations never happened. The selected panel is also deleted from the history window. Graphical histories are useful for reviewing, undoing, and redoing commands. They can also be used as the basis for a macro by example or programming by example facility that we have also incorporated into Chimera. Now I'm going to write a macro to left align two rectangles by demonstration. Initially, I draw two sample rectangles. Then I select 0 and 90-degree slope lines from the control panel. These are snap-dragging alignment lines. I next select two vertices to generate these alignment lines, the upper left vertex of the lower box and the lower right vertex of the upper box. I now select the top box, since this is the box that I'm going to move. I move the software cursor to the lower left vertex of this box. The software cursor and the selected box will gravitate towards intersections of alignment lines. Now I snap this top box to the appropriate intersection. The top box is now left aligned with the bottom one. The operations that I performed were captured in the history window below. I'll now select those operations that I want to be encapsulated into the macro. Here, all operations but the two add box operations in the beginning are to be used, since I want existing boxes to be arguments to the macro. After selecting the panels, I choose the macroize operation. This opens a macro builder window. This window contains all the panels that I selected from the history. I'll move this window on top of the history window. The next step is to select the arguments to the macro. To do this, I make the panels editable by selecting the checkbox at the bottom of the window. I can now select objects in these panels. First, I'll select the rectangle that remains fixed. I can do this from any panel where it's visible. I type the name of the argument in the text input widget and execute the make argument command. A panel is prepended to the beginning of the history, showing the argument name and the selected rectangle. Next, I select from one of the panels the rectangle that was moved during the alignment process and make it an argument too. I'll give it the name moved, and I'll execute the make argument command. Another panel is also generated at the beginning of the macro. Argument declarations are all placed at the beginning of macros, just as they appear at the beginning of conventional procedures. If I played back the operations that I had executed verbatim, they wouldn't do the right thing. It's necessary to generalize the macro to work in other contexts. Chimera has an inference engine that chooses the most likely interpretation of each command according to built-in heuristics. Here I have Chimera choose a likely generalization for the macro. The user can view the default generalizations and override them if necessary. For example, let's view the generalizations of the last panel in the history by executing the generalize panel command. This command generates a set of checklists that shows various generalizations for the operations in the panel and allows us to override those chosen by the system. For example, the first step of this panel was to select the object to be dragged. In the first checklist, the system shows that two possible interpretations of this operation are to select the argument named moved and to select a constant object. It chose the first interpretation. There are a number of other generalizations that were made for this panel. In this case, all of these generalizations are correct. I'm now going to apply our macro to a new scene. To do this, I switch to a new buffer and create two additional rectangles. Now I choose the invoke macro command from the menu. A little macro invocation window appears. I'm going to move it so that it's clearly visible. This window is labeled no name since I haven't named the macro yet. It contains two entries, one for each of the arguments that we declared. The first row is labeled fixed for the stationary argument. It contains two buttons, one to set the argument and the other to display it. The second row is for the argument named moved, and it contains two similar buttons. This time, I'll left align the lower rectangle with the upper one. I select the top rectangle and set it to be the fixed argument. I select the bottom rectangle and set it to be the moved argument. Now I press the apply button. The macro is invoked on the new scene. The 5 techniques shown here, graphical search and replace, constraint-based search and replace, constraints for multiple snapshots, editable graphical histories, and macros by example, have all been developed to facilitate graphical editing, but some of these can be applied to other domains. We are interested in further exploring these techniques and developing different example-based techniques for graphical editing and other applications.